So before we get into whatever, and we may get into this anyway because it's kind of on my mind, but we may get into other things because of the message we preached last week. Does anybody want to talk about the message last week specifically?
I would just say that my friend said that was just life-changing for her. She just kept mulling it in her mind, and it really blessed her so much.
Hallelujah.
That was great. That was a wonderful message.
Yeah, and that message just... we talked about the wisdom that will bring forth that life in the message. Mm-hmm. But one of the greatest things about seeing the love of God manifest in you is being able to experience a life where your heart does not count or keep an account of the wrongs that have been committed against you. Mm-hmm. That is one of... And that sounds so funny to like the wisdom of the world or the carnal mind. But one of the most blessed lives a person could ever live is a life where their heart doesn't keep an account of the wrongs committed against them. Where their heart is free from that kind of thinking. Where you're keeping track of the wrongs committed against you. And it doesn't just speak of keeping track of those who have committed wrongs against you, but it also speaks of your heart keeping track of them in the sense of you define yourself by the wrongs that have been committed against you. And so what it's talking about there is that you'll judge other people. You'll keep a record of the accounts that people have committed against you, the wrongs they've committed against you. But it'll also be where you'll define yourself by the wrongs that have been committed against you. Right? And that is what the Bible would call a cursed life. Not that God curses you. And we have to move away from that way of thinking. When we think if a curse is present, that means God cursed us. No. There is a life that is a cursed life. Meaning the only way you can describe it is to say it's a cursed life. And a cursed life is just the antithesis of the life of God, is what it is. Right? And so that's a cursed life. When we're busy walking around and our hearts keeping an account of wrongs that have been committed against us, that's not the life of God. That kind of a life cometh not from above. And it's not born from the wisdom that comes from above. It's born from beneath. It's born from the devilish mind. Okay? Now, none of us need to feel any shame if we're experiencing that life, because the wisdom that comes from above says you can't bring forth that life by your desire. Right? James said it this way: the desire of man to experience the life of God cannot bring about the life of God. Right? So your passion to bring about what I just said, or your passion to want that, can't bring it about. Only God can bring it about. So there's no shame if we find ourselves in that place. We were born into a world where everything in the world is actually trying to shape our thoughts that way. And so what we do if we find ourselves in the place where we're keeping an account of the wrongs committed against us. Look at the injustice that's been committed against us. And we're imputing that injustice to other people. And we're allowing that injustice to shape our thoughts about ourselves and our life. Listen, man, that's not the life of God. And let us recognize that's not the life of God. And then do what any son or daughter of the Most High God would do in that place. Father, this cometh not from above. This body of death I'm experiencing, into your hands I commit my desire to be free. Right? And you commit your desire into His hands. Because the righteousness of God, or the ability of God, is the only thing that possesses the power to set you free. Right?
Jesus said that's what He came to do.
That's what He came to do. And Jesus is the arm of God. Jesus is what we would call the arm of God. So if God were to sit at a table and was like, let's arm wrestle, man. And you could see the arm of God. You'd see Jesus. Right? And so if you want to say that God came to wrestle with the death and the wisdom in the world, you would see that God's arm was Jesus. Right? And see, that's the only way the thing can happen. So many times human beings start with a desire or a passion for life. We start with a desire and a passion to see life. We start with a desire and a passion to see everything that isn't of life. We desire to see it go away. We start with the desire. And so what we would say is we have a zeal for the life of God. We have a zeal to see the life of God manifest. We have a zeal to see the things that aren't of the life of God disappear and vanish. We have a zeal for that. But our zeal many times is not according to knowledge. Right? We have a zeal for these things, but then our zeal about those things coming to pass is not according to knowledge. And so then we actually implement a system to try to bring what we have a zeal for to pass, and the system we implement not only can't bring it to pass, it can only further the thing that we desire to see vanish. And this is what Paul said about the Jewish guys. They have a zeal for God, but their zeal, it isn't according to knowledge, man. And what it says is, they, being ignorant of the righteousness of God, set about to establish their own righteousness. So them being ignorant of God's ability to bring forth life, took their zeal for the life of God and set about to bring it about through their own ability, instead of seeing that God's the only one who can do it.
Right.
And listen, guys, this is very relevant, especially right now. And, everybody can feel safe that if we're going to talk about some things that are going on currently, that they'll be stricken from the record if anybody wants it to be stricken from the record. Because we want people to be able to hear the recordings and be blessed, but we also want people here to be able to talk about things that are hurting them, or things that are bothering them, or that they feel moved by. And what I would say right now, that we have this very thing actually going on in the world.
Absolutely.
There's a zeal to see racism and hatred end. A whole lot of people have a desire to see racism and hatred end, right? But their zeal is not according to the knowledge of what can actually destroy racism and hatred. And so then, them being ignorant of God's ability to destroy racism and hatred, and the way God would go about doing it, they are now seeking to establish their own ability to destroy racism and hatred. And in them doing that, they're actually implementing the system and the wisdom that produces racism and hatred. And they're actually now going to bring forth more racism and hatred. So man thinks, well, as long as our desire is in the right place, then it'll all work out great.
Yeah.
Listen, in the letter of James, those Jewish guys that were experiencing hard times, they had a desire for their soul to be restored. But then they thought that they were going to now bring to pass their desire. And the system they implemented to save their souls, where they were going to now treat the law preachers and the Judaizers and the rich guys in the Jewish system with more honor than the poor people. Because they thought that would get them back in with the money. And then that would save their souls from the tribulation. So they had a desire for their souls to be saved. They didn't see the word God spoke about Jesus was the only thing that could save their soul. So they enlisted their own ability to try to save their own souls. And the fruit of them doing that was more death, because it caused them to despise the poor people and exalt the rich people. Right? That's not love. That's not love. See how that didn't bring about the love of God? And so we have that very thing going on right now, guys, where we got a whole lot of people that are living from pain and offense and suffering in their soul. And they have a desire to see the suffering in their soul come to an end, but they don't have the knowledge of God about what will bring that to an end. And so now they're enlisting their own ability to try to bring it about themselves, being ignorant of the fact that they're actually busy with the system that produces racism and hatred. And they're going to bring about more of it, because they're seeking to bring peace to their souls from the foundation of self-justification. And self-justification, what it always does is it brings strife into a situation. And what it does is it seeks to lure the people on the other side into the strife. And so now, when you come to somebody seeking to establish or justify yourself, you know what you're going to do? You're going to be doing something that compels the other side to also now think they got to justify themselves.
Right.
And now you got two groups of people who think, I got to justify myself.
Yeah.
When I look around the landscape of the world, forget about what the world even thinks. There's very few believers that are even free from self-justification. There's very few believers. I mean, I'm not shocked at what the world says, but when I'm on Facebook and seeing what believers and supposedly leaders in the church are saying about what's going on, my goodness, man, they've never seen themselves crucified with Christ. They're living from self-justification. And whenever you try to justify yourself, the only way you can justify yourself, which is to try to bring peace to your own soul, is if you scapegoat someone else.
Huh.
And so when Adam wanted to justify himself, when God came and said, did you eat from that tree, Adam? Adam was filled with all self-justification. Notice what he did to try to bring peace to his soul. He scapegoated Eve and God.
Yeah.
It's that woman you gave me. Notice how the fingers are over there. Now listen, God's not filled with self-justification. So God's heart wasn't moved by that. It didn't lure him into, well, you notice how God didn't say, it's not my fault. You notice how God didn't try to fight to prove that it wasn't his fault? You notice how it goes silent after that? See, that's how the Spirit of God will work in somebody. The Spirit of God, and dwelling in a person's heart and animating the thoughts in that person's heart, will never come to that person's heart and tell them about the wrongs that have been committed against them. Ever! So if you're busy with some wisdom that is all the time telling you about the wrongs that have been committed against you or are being committed against you and how you got to fight to make those wrongs right, listen, that spirit cometh not from above.
That's good.
It cometh from below.
Yeah.
And this is not to condemn anybody who is busy with this. It's to reveal the wisdom for what it is so we can recognize what's trying to happen to us. And we can be free from that thing. Because it looks real good on the outside, doesn't it? It looks like it's right to fight for this, doesn't it?
The crusade, yeah.
The tree looked good for food. It looked like it was wisdom. Jesus saw the fig tree from afar, and it had leaves. Do you know what it means when a fig tree has leaves? It means it's supposed to have fruit. And so it looked like it was good to bring forth the fruit of God, God's life. But when it got up on it, there was no fruit there. And so people are busy with the wisdom that they think is good and that they think will bring forth the fruit of God's life. And everything I'm saying right now isn't to be against them. It's not to discredit their pain or their suffering. It's not to be against them or their pain or their suffering, but it's to pull the veil back so that they can see the wisdom that they're busy with actually sits with the sword that wants to kill them. We have this idea that dismissing and we have this idea that sympathizing with people's pain is now helping further them in the wisdom that brings them pain. That's what the world would say. If you're actually sympathizing or empathizing with somebody's pain, what you're really busy with is looking at that which brings forth the pain, the root. And you're now going to take the axe to the root. Sympathizing with someone's pain isn't going to say, oh man, you're right. Look at all these horrible things that have happened to you. We got to do something about it. That's not sympathizing with someone's pain. That's what the world would call sympathizing with someone's pain. You can hug somebody and say, I know, man. I know what injustice does to our hearts. I know that you're experiencing pain. But listen, man, this thing is trying to compel you to a life of self-justification. This pain and suffering you feel is trying to corrupt the wisdom in your heart, to get your life to be born from beneath, where you're always laboring and toiling, striving to try to find justice from the world, striving to try to be justified from the world. You see, that's how you actually sympathize with someone's pain. The reality is, guys, and I'm going to start saying a lot of things soon. The reality is, people on both sides are going to hate me for saying what I say.
Oh well.
They're going to hate me. Because they're going to view what I'm saying as to try to dismiss or discredit their pain. When in actuality, I care more about their freaking pain than they do. Because I'm willing to lay down my life and let them hate me and want to kill me, all for concern for their heart. Listen, my heart's free. So, it's not that I'm going to now subject myself to anger and hatred on both sides for myself. You see what I'm saying? The only reason why I would even say the things that I do is because I care so much about the pain in their heart, and I actually have eyes to see what's causing it. And I have eyes to see they'll even be angry and offended by the truth. And so I have eyes to see that people I love and people that have followed me for years are going to be deeply angry and offended by the things I'm going to say over the next couple weeks. And it's been difficult for me because you never want to say something to people that you love that you know may cause them to feel anger and offense.
And push you out.
Because you only love them. But you know what God said, Greg, if you actually love them, man, you'll lay down your life. And you'll speak to what needs to be spoken to regardless of what they think about it initially. That's the life of God. See, Jesus knew what they were going to do to him for saying what he said. But he cared more about their life than his own. So he said, even though what I'm going to say is going to cause people to bite and devour me, and to backbite me, and to want to murder me, man, I love their lives so much that I see what's causing the pain in their heart, and I'm willing to lay down my life to attack that thing. And he did, didn't he? Now listen, you can't work this stuff up. The life of God, the wisdom of God gives birth to this stuff in you. And so I hope you guys understand what I'm saying. And at the end of me saying all these things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my own pain, and I don't want to even call it pain, but I will say this. I do feel pressed in upon by what I'm going to say, because I realize that people that I call brother, that I love, are going to, they're not going to have a positive reaction. I realize the ministry is going to take a serious hit because of what I'm going to say. And I feel pressed in on by that. But I'll just say this. I find the Spirit of God rising up in me and filling me with boldness to say what needs to be said, regardless of what people think. Because I care more about their lives than my own. See, that's what real love is. We think love is helping people to continue in that which destroys them. That's not love, man.
To feel comfortable.
Right, to feel comfortable. We feel that love is me coming and helping them justify them in their pain. That's not love, man. The root of what brings forth pain isn't the wisdom of God or truth. And so if I try to come and justify them in their pain, that's only furthering the death that's bringing them pain in their lives. So we can hug somebody and say, I know, man. I know what injustice does in the heart of a human being.
Tell you what, there is a great allure when you watch. I mean, it's the what is it, the white supremacists and the other side, whoever it is, the ones that want to take the statues down. Or whatever. Yeah, it's man, you look at this stuff, and I mean, it's not so much the neo-Nazis, the real radicals. It's normal people who have a feeling about whether these statues should go or not, or what should be done because of the schism that exists in our society here. And there's an allure in our hearts to want to join a side because we may somehow or another empathize with one side or the other. But man, the minute you begin to do that and enter into that realm, you are immediately begin to draw distinctions between people. Right. You're not loving people, you're drawing distinctions and judging people. And it's so natural to be drawn to that because you do have feelings about that. But God, you just can't enter into that. Paul says something, and I don't know whether it's just paraphrased in the Living Bible this way, but he says, no man enlisted in an army gets entangled in civilian affairs. Have you ever read
Yeah.
that or heard that?
Mhm.
And I'm not sure how, like, one of the translations would say it, but I know the Living Bible says it that way.
Yeah, I've read that.
And basically what that's saying, don't get entangled in the things of this world. Listen, you know, back in the 60s with the world means now, and love is love, sweet love, that is what the world means. That is what the world means. And I'm going to tell you something. It's not loving this group. It's loving everybody.
That's right.
You have to have a love in your heart for everyone. That's where the answer is.
Yeah, the love of God loves the racist.
Yes.
Right, right.
Yeah.
We don't like that, do we? We don't like that. The love of God loves the racist. The love of God loves the person that's filled with hate. That's what the love of God looks like. And so if we're busy with an anti-hate group that says it's okay to be against or to hate people who are hateful, or it's okay to say things to destroy those who are filled with hate, listen, our anti-hate group is not an anti-hate group at all. It's actually a hate group masquerading as an anti-hate group. It's a wolf in a sheep's clothing. Because an anti-hate group, I think it's interesting that it's called anti-hate. It's not called a love group. To be against some group of people is not love.
No.
For the love of God is for all people.
That's
Right? And this is difficult for us to understand. And when we talk about what the life of God looks like, we don't say it so we can go off and bring it about. So when I say that the love of God would love the racist, I'm not telling you, you got to go do that.
Right.
I'm telling you that when God's wisdom that was revealed in Christ have its perfect work in you, it will cause you to even love the people that hate you. It will cause you to care more about their life than your own life. If you notice in this situation with the statues, both group of people are busy thinking about themselves and their own pain. We don't disparage them for their pain. We don't act as if they haven't experienced pain. But we're not going to now live as if that's the right thing or if that's born from the life of God. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because if the life of God was if the wisdom, the Spirit of God was actually behind this thing, you'd be caring more about the hurt feelings of the other side than you would your own. And so even if you've experienced racial injustice in this country, guys, I hate to break it to everybody. Every human being has experienced racial injustice at some time or another. Every single human being, every classification of people throughout all history. All history. Jesus was born into a society that was persecuted for their race by the Romans to a degree that was just obscene. Obscene. He never once preached against the Romans. Because he didn't come to clean the outside of the cup. He claimed to clean the inside of the cup. He realized that you don't set someone free from injustice through the world, but you set someone free from injustice in their heart. He came and said the kingdom of God is not from without, it's from within. You see, we constantly think we're going to bring about peace by what we do to change the world. You can't freaking find peace from the world, man. You can't. Peace is not found from without, it's found from within. You guys understand this dynamics? So listen, whether we want the statues to stay or whether we think the statues should go has no bearing on whether we're going to experience peace in our heart. Those things don't matter at all, but what's in the heart of people is what matters. Follow what I'm saying? So if you think the statue staying is going to bring peace to your heart and your mind, or you think the statue's leaving is going to bring peace to your heart and your mind, I'm just going to say it as it is, and it's going to be radical. You're busy with idolatry.
Right.
That's a statue. If you think the keeping of the statue is going to bring peace to your heart and your mind, or you think the removing of the statue is going to bring peace to your heart and mind, you're busy with idolatry. You're worshiping the works of your own hands. That's what you're doing.
That's good.
That's what you're doing, man.
Right.
That is what you're doing. So-
Picture of what you just said.
So let's see what's going on. And people from both sides need to be free. Listen, I got lots of friends that love those statues just from an artistic standpoint. They're art people in New Orleans. Their families have been here for hundreds of years. They look at those statues, they don't connect it to any type of civil war. They connect it to art and sculpture and history. It's not wrong for them to like the statues because of that. So my heart is not to be against them for wanting the statues to stay. But my heart is to set them free from thinking the statue staying or going can control their peace. Do you see what I'm saying? Because listen, if our peace is subject to this world, we're always going to be tossed to and fro. We're never going to find peace. We're never going to overcome the tribulation in the world. So when I say these things, it's with the love of people's hearts and wanting people's hearts to be able to overcome the tribulation in the world and to experience a life that can be filled with peace no matter what happens in the world around them. Right? And likewise, man, I got lots of friends. Listen, man, I grew up playing ball. I grew up in the hood. Most of my friends were colored, Vietnamese, all this kinds of stuff. Hispanic, black. Listen, some of my close friends that are black feel pain. They do. But listen, removing the statue ain't going to save them from their pain.
Right.
But if they can be free from the wisdom that says you can find peace from the world or changing the world, then they can find peace that can overcome the tribulation that's happened in the world. See, that makes no sense. Like some of the people that I love, man, it's like they watch these statues get pulled down, and I'm going to keep saying this so people don't lose sight of this. This isn't to be against either side of people. It's to talk about the wisdoms that are behind these things that want to kill all people. Right? That's what we're talking about.
Right.
But when we see that statue pulled down, and we see the heart behind that pulled down, do any of us think that's the Spirit of God at work there? Does any of us think it's the Spirit of God that yanked the statue down and was kicking the statue and flipping off the statue and spitting on the statue and coming together like a mob to pull down the statue? Does anybody think that that's the peaceable fruit of righteousness?
No.
Because that statue was hateful, so they had to do that to it. That's their mindset.
That's trying to find life by the sword.
Right.
You live by the sword, you die by the sword. Is what that is. Now, do any of us think that's what the life of God looks like?
You know, it's so odd. I mean, while you're saying that, it's like I can see them trying to grasp it and tear it down has no peace. But then I can also see one that says, oh, this offends you, then I'll lay it down.
Mm-hmm.
You know, has peace.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely.
You know, it's like from what comes out of your heart again.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when you were talking about knowledge, I was going, where's Greg going? Where's Greg going? And I couldn't. And then you said something about they're trying to do this in their righteousness, and immediately I said, they're doing this without God.
Uh-huh.
You know, and that's because, you know, when you asked me about what righteousness was, it brought me like all over the place until I went, it's in the presence of God. So they're trying to do a right thing without the presence of God.
Yep.
And they have no knowledge.
That's right. And that, I'm with you. The life of God will cause you to lay down whatever because you prefer someone's life over your own.
Yeah.
So what I'm saying isn't about when we say what spirit is behind the yanking down of the statue, we're not arguing for the other side.
Yeah.
That's not what we're doing. We're just talking about the wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't really reason your way and explain, or how can I enter into this and kind of make it right this good way I'm looking at it or anything like that. You know,
Yeah.
That's not the idea.
That's not what's going to happen. And the reason we want to reveal the spirit that's at work there is because those people, many of them have suffered.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, and the only reason why you would reveal the spirit that's behind that is so they could actually be set free from their suffering. Because I can guarantee you this, the yanking down of that statue does not possess the ability to save their soul from their suffering.
Right.
It actually will further the thing that has brought them suffering. Right?
Stoking the fire.
So again, what I'm saying isn't about whether it's right to take down the statue or whether it's right to keep the statue. It's the spirit behind the whole matter. Right? And that spirit cometh not from above. It cometh from below. I mean, we'll just read this verse real quick. And I can't say this enough. I say these things because I'm for all people. It'd be much easier for me not to say any of this stuff. It'd be much easier for me not to say any of this stuff. And I actually was just going to not say anything until I saw all the supposed leaders in the body of Christ coming with the voice of activism instead of preaching Christ and Him crucified. And I thought, my goodness, man. Do you know how Jesus would denounce racism? He wouldn't come in and preach, thou shalt not be racist. You know how Jesus would denounce racism? He'd destroy the thing that produces it. Which wouldn't look like it was denouncing racism at all to the carnal mind. You know what Jesus would preach to denounce racism? He'd preach forgiveness. And that the life of God or the love of God manifested would love the racist. And the way that racism would be conquered would by people no longer knowing themselves after the flesh and love conquering evil. That's what Jesus would preach. Jesus preached love your enemy.
Right.
And He wasn't commanding people to love their enemy. He was saying, listen, man, God loves His enemies. And so when the life of God is actually coming out of you, it will look like love for your enemy. So if you don't see it look like that, you don't condemn yourself or think you're invalidated now. You don't think, my gosh, I'm not as I ought to be. I got to go do that. You tell God, I find something in my heart that is not bringing forth love for people that hate me. I can't set myself free from that. Heck, I don't even know how it really got in there. But into your hands, I make my heart available for you to set me free. Right? And He will. That's what He desires to do. His whole desire is to bring forth life in you. But listen to what James says. I love the letter of James about this. Listen, and I speak boldly about this, and I'm going to say the prefaces before I say this. Everything I say is to be for all people and not to be against any person, but to be against the wisdom that is against all people, no matter what person that wisdom is working out of. Right? But there's a whole lot of people that call themselves prophets in the church that are activists and social justice warriors. Listen, Jesus wasn't an activist. He wasn't a social justice warrior.
That's true.
He realized injustice is something that happens inside of the heart of a human being. He came to heal the brokenhearted. And so He came to preach a word that could set people free in their hearts. But there's a whole lot of people, man, claiming to be prophets that knoweth not God at all. It doesn't take a prophet to stand up and say, thou shalt not be racist. You know what it does? It takes a prophet to see the wisdom that is actually at the root of racism and speak to that. If you actually want to denounce racism, you preach Christ and Him crucified every Sunday. Why would that denounce racism? Well, what is the root of racism? One of the roots of racism is people knowing themselves after the flesh. Defining themselves by the flesh. What they see in their flesh. What color of skin they see. What social status they see. What accomplishments they see. Another root of racism is to define your life by the life that's in the world. If you define your life by the life that's in the world, listen, man, you're all the time going to be walking around thinking that other people can take your life or hurt your life. And that will cause you to hate them. So if you define your life by the life that's in the world, you might say, this is what brings life. And anything you see to be against this, you'll be against. And so you know how you destroy that? You come and preach about how we were crucified with Christ to the life that's in the world and to a life where we're defined by the color of our skin. And you would come and preach how there's no more Jew or Gentile. There's no more black or white. There's no more yellow or tan. There's no more German or American. There's no more French or English. But there's only human beings that are all the God kind and that have all been cut from the rock that is God. You see, from that place, unity comes forth. But when you know each other after the flesh, or define one another by the life that's in the world, or define one another by the life you've experienced from the world, you tend to separate yourselves into different factions. You'll say, they don't know my pain. You just drew separation. They don't understand my plight. You just drew separation. The moment you come with the language to destroy racism that includes the color of people's skin inside of that language, you're speaking the language of racism. You are. You are. And so if your desire to destroy racism entails words like white privilege and Black Lives Matter, you're separating people and dividing people up by their color and the life they've experienced in the world. And you're making it impossible for there to be any union. And you're making it impossible for people to come together as one. I hate to break it to everybody. All of us. Because all of us sit with some kind of persuasion that we think comes from above and we think makes sense. And we think, this is like the wisdom of the world. It's like a cliche. It's probably written on t-shirts and mugs. You can't know the pain someone feels until you've walked a mile in their shoes. And then we say that from the foundation of the pain must look the same. Listen, guys. Paul taught people about marriage and raising kids. He was never freaking married. Yeah. He never had any kids. You know how he can do that? Because the Spirit of God knows all things. The Spirit of the Son has suffered every persecution that could ever come against any human being. He knows it. He felt it. He has compassion for it. He doesn't divide up a line between the different injustices people have experienced. He says all injustice is the same and does the same thing in the heart of a human being. So every human being in this world has experienced injustice. Every single one of us has experienced injustice, whether it be racial injustice, whether it be through disease, through sickness, through death, through financial problems, through issues with jobs, through issues in the world. That's all injustice. Death is injustice. Sickness is injustice. Losing loved ones being murdered, it's injustice. All of us have seen these things. All of us have experienced these things. We've all experienced injustice, and that injustice seeks to do the same thing in all of our hearts. You see, the language that destroys racism comes and points out to one person how their injustice is actually the same as the injustice of this person over here. And explains to them how it's the same. Now they feel compassion for one another and see that they've lived and experienced the same thing. And instead of saying, you've had this and I haven't, you know what will happen? Me too, man. And you hug and cry. Right? The second you think that somebody else hasn't experienced the injustice you've experienced, I guarantee you God has not come down and stood on the earth and looked at one group of people and said, well, it's true. You've suffered more than these people. God's never said that. You know what God said? All people are suffering at the hands of sin and death. All of us have experienced suffering at the hands of sin and death. All of us have experienced injustice at the hands of sin and death. Now, the fruit of that may look different from situation to situation, but the root of it is the same. And the effect of it in our hearts is the same. And when we view it like that, it can help us to see the pain in somebody else's heart. I got to tell you, I don't get upset with the people who are protesting and want the statues torn down. Because I can see beyond the wisdom that is hurting them, and I can see they're hurting. And so I care about their hurting. Right? So I'm not judging them and saying, well, look at them, wanting to do this, wanting to do that. No, that wisdom cometh not from above either. I see they have a very real pain that is bringing forth this action, but I see that the wisdom behind it isn't from God, and now I want to come and love them by revealing what that wisdom is. Do you guys see that? That's a hard saying for us, man. We think the right thing to do is to fight for justice in the world. That's what we think. Isn't it? And we define that the way Peter defined it when he pulled the sword out of his sheath and he went and sliced the ear off the centurion. That's how we define it. Now listen, we can experience justice in this world, but we'll experience it in our hearts. And it won't come from the world. We'll experience justice in this world by seeing what God's done to serve us with justice, by taking a human being and conquering the sin and the death that was bringing injustice to our hearts. Right? And now that can bring justice to our hearts while we live in a world that is filled with all injustice. And you know what it does? It guards our hearts from the injustice in the world. It guards our hearts from the pain that comes from the injustice in this world. And it causes us to experience a life that overcomes the injustice in the world. Right? You guys see that? You guys see how that works?
I do say, though, that it is hard to see ourselves in the same plight as people who really... I mean, most of us here have grown up privileged. That's all there is to it. And I don't want to, it's just hard to see other people who have nothing that we're in the same place as they are. You know what I mean?
And that's what you want to attack.
Yeah.
You see that very thought. And there's no shame in feeling that way.
Yeah.
Did God come down and tell you most of us have grown up privileged?
No.
Okay, so who told you that?
I guess I've always felt that because I feel like I have a nice place. I mean, compared to a lot of the world.
Well, what's your definition of privilege?
Well, yeah, I'm thinking of things, and which is not.
But do things bring life?
No.
No. So is that privilege? Based on the world's definition, which is what we're busy attacking.
Mm-hmm. I understand. Yeah, it's just like to separate those things is kind of hard to me.
Yes. And Linda, that's by the Spirit of God that you say that. You know what God would say? Yeah, Linda. With man, it's impossible.
Right.
Yeah.
It's impossible for us.
Right.
That's it.
That's exactly right. What you say is exactly right. Yeah, it's kind of hard for us. You bet it is. It's impossible.
Listen, we want to judge and evaluate and figure out everything.
Yeah.
We really do. I mean,
Yeah.
why these people feel that way, why these people feel that way.
Right. And where should I be in it?
We want to try to correct it.
Yeah.
We want to try and correct stuff.
Yeah.
And listen, no matter how much you might want to correct the world, you're going to have very little effect on it. Matter of fact, as you go about correcting it, you're usually amplifying the problem.
Yep.
You find yourself amplifying the problem. You can't correct the world. We can't correct the world.
Yeah.
But, you know what? Yesterday I went to the shopping center, we went shopping, and I had interactions with some people that were like waiting on us. A black lady, a Chinese guy that I bought some sunglasses from, and someone else. And man, as I interacted with these people, it was like, man, I just felt this overwhelming drawing of myself to this person and wanting to relate to them, wanting to love this person. And the interactions I had was so good it affected, I know it affected the folks I was relating to. And it was like, man, this is how the world has changed.
Yeah.
It's not in going somewhere to do something to make it right. Not even with the right mindset. It's just in being the right kind of person right where you are right now. That's it. If you go somewhere else to fix it, even if you think you're right, you're not, it ain't gonna work. You gotta be where you are right now with the heart that God gave you.
Yeah.
Amen. And even that's only going to work through the preaching of Christ and Him crucified.
Yes.
So even if
Yes.
I go love some people, if I don't ever reveal Christ and Him crucified
right.
to their hearts, that might be nice in that one situation where we feel warm fuzzies and we cry,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and they might feel loved. But if it doesn't now come with the word of Christ and Him crucified, we can change people's hearts. That's the only thing that can happen. And we can't change their hearts by our ability.
Right.
We can change their hearts by revealing Christ to them.
You want to hear about the sunglasses?
Yeah.
Let me tell you about the sunglasses. So, I'm looking at these sunglasses. You know the old Ray-Ban sunglasses? You can turn that off if you want.
No, because I'm going to
looking
say
at
something
the old
after.
Ray-Ban sunglasses, that black ring at the top with the gold on the bottom like that. You know what I'm talking about? And I said, you know, man, I said, my whole life, I looked at these sunglasses and said, I would never put those sunglasses on my face. But you know, I grew my beard, I got a little bit older, and I put these things on, and I said, my whole perspective on these sunglasses had changed. I like those sunglasses. I'm buying these things. So, I'm buying sunglasses, and this thought pops into my mind about how our perspectives can be changed about things. And this is the guy that, I think he was maybe Vietnamese or Japanese, I'm not sure. You know? And so anyway, I start sharing about how my perspective on Jesus and what He did for us changed. And he was just immediately captivated by that. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, there was a time when I believed that somehow or another I had to make my life appear in such a way that would be pleasing to God. But in Jesus, I began to see a different perspective, just like on these glasses, of Jesus, and how he actually viewed me as righteous and perfect and holy. And He came to reveal that in His Son. And He says, I like that perspective.
I like the way you think.
I like the way you think. and listen, at the time, I presented a whole lot better than I just did. But it was so good to just share that.
I like how you think. And the Spirit of God wax bold and reach. Hold on, I want to hit this before we move on.
Yes.
We got to attack this idea of privilege.
Yes.
Okay?
Absolutely.
Just so we could see what's behind it and what we call privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? And we'll just use a couple extreme examples that most everybody has other things they could talk about like this. But when I was in high school, one of my friends grew up in a neighborhood that the wisdom of the world would call privileged and say they had a privileged life. Now, when he was 16 years old, walking out of a restaurant in New Orleans with his girlfriend on their homecoming night, he got shot in the face right as he walked out of the restaurant, and his head was blown off for his wallet. Try telling his parents they've got privilege. Try telling his parents they've had a privileged life. Another one of my friends was out on a pier in Mississippi, Henderson Point, 16 years old with his girlfriend. And they were out on the end of a pier, and a guy went down the pier and took a metal bar and whacked him over the head and then raped his girlfriend and beat her. The guy died. Try telling his parents their life is privileged. Try telling them that. I can't even count on the fingers or toes on my feet the number of friends that I've had murdered or committed suicide. Try telling their families they've experienced a privileged life. I tell you what, that don't compute to them. And so the conversation, when we say that some have experienced a privileged life and some have not, we're judging it by the world, instead of seeing that sin and death has come against all of us. Right? There's nobody who's escaped it. And so the idea of what privilege looks like is a very distorted and subjective thing. And if we dug deeper, we'd find a lot of things about all of our lives that don't look so privileged. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, yeah.
Try telling the kid's mom who shot my friend in the face she's had a privileged life. Try telling my friend in Mandeville who comes to the Bible study at the Candy Bank, whose parents were just attacked by a 16-year-old kid with a hammer, and he smashed their skulls in with a hammer, and his father died. Try telling him who lives in Old Mandeville, we call that privileged, try telling him he's privileged.
Good point.
Because listen, we'll just look at it this way. A person could have everything that the world calls privilege. Even everything in the world go right for them. But they don't possess eternal life. Are they privileged?
No. Nor do they feel privileged.
Nor
they
do
don't
they
feel privileged.
Nor do they
They
feel
don't feel
privileged.
privileged.
That's it. And that's why this type of language, and Linda, it's by the Spirit of God that you said that. And so I hope you understand what I'm saying. Okay. This isn't to be against what you said. What you said is the truth. And it needs to be brought out so we could say, by man, it's impossible. But by only God can bring this forth in us. But the moment we look at somebody else and try to tell them they've had a privileged life in comparison to our life, what we're doing is disparaging whatever injustice or suffering they've experienced. And many times we got no idea what they've experienced. And when I say try telling my friend's mom that, do you know what comes alive inside of her when someone tries to talk about her privilege? Self-justification. She wants to know, what the heck are you talking about?
Yeah.
Do you know that I haven't slept in 20 years? Do you know that I can't even go to bed at night without this vision of my son who I couldn't even look at in the casket because his head was blown off? Now, when you come with the word to tell her about her privilege, do you know what that immediately does inside of her? It brings something forth in her where now not only she can't even begin to think about your injustice, but all she can feel is that you're disparaging her. And now that creates fighting back and forth. Fighting back and forth. Where neither side can understand the injustice and the pain that the other side is feeling. Right? And what all human beings need to realize is we've all experienced injustice. All of us. All of us. Your injustice is not greater than mine. My injustice is not greater than yours. There's no more Jew or Gentile. There's no more black or white. There's no more American or German. There is one human being. Every human being has been attacked by the system of sin and death. And that system of sin and death has brought injustice against every human being. And all of the injustice is equal injustice. And when we begin to look at it like that, we can start to speak a language that can allow other people the opportunity to empathize with our injustice. But the second we try to prove our injustice by disparaging other people's injustice, we eliminate their ability for them to hear or empathize with us. We eliminate it. The only way a human being on the other end of that can still empathize is if they're filled with all wisdom. And I mean the wisdom from above.
Yeah.
So if a person is really walking in grace and somebody comes with that language, they won't feel, well, I've had injustice too. They'll still be able to hear. They'll know the truth that all people have experienced injustice, but they'll still say, man, tell me what you've gone through. I'm so sorry about the pain. But I got good news for you. By one man, Adam, death came into the world, and death brought injustice to all people. But by one man, Christ, by his righteousness, justice has entered into the world through him. And we can find justice in our hearts, even here and now, in the midst of all injustice. And that will even be unto the manifestation of justice in this body, in this creation, when it's glorified and I get clothed in a glorified body. The only justice is when the earth is glorified. The only outward manifestation of justice is when the earth is glorified and your body is glorified.
Right.
Do any of you think you're going to bring that about?
No.
Is there any pulling down of statues that's going to now glorify creation and glorify our bodies? Is there any keeping of the statues that's going to now glorify creation or glorify our bodies? Guys, it's foolishness to think that we're going to bring about justice outwardly or experience justice inwardly by what we're going to bring about outwardly. That's foolishness. That's the wisdom that Christ made foolish on the cross. And let me just evoke the Spirit of the Son that dwelled in Paul. I didn't come with the wisdom of the world or the words that man would call wisdom today, but I came with the wisdom of God. That is actually the only thing that's full of power to set our hearts free from injustice. In fact, the world and the wisdom in the world would come and sit here today and say, "What are you talking about?" And then they'd label me a bigot, a racist. Or the side that wants to keep the statues would label me a liberal.
Right.
And the real bigot and fascist.
Right.
Do you guys understand that? When Paul said he didn't come with words of wisdom, he wasn't saying he didn't come with any words of all. He's saying he didn't come with the words of man's wisdom. He came with a wisdom that was foolishness to man's wisdom. He came with the wisdom that was revealed at the cross, which is the only thing that contains the power unto salvation in our hearts. The more we think we're going to bring salvation in our hearts by making that which is outward right, the more we're going to experience suffering inwardly. The more we're going to experience hatred, envy, backbiting, gossiping, division. That's how the thing works, man. That's how the thing works. And so, guys, the end goal is to experience peace on the inside. I think most people can agree with that in this situation, no matter what side you're on. If the end goal is to experience peace on the inside, then let us now see, what is it that will bring that peace? Is it Christ or is it statues? If it be statues, are we worshiping the works of our own hands? Listen, if we could bring forth justice and peace in our souls by changing the world outwardly, why do we need Jesus? Why do we need Jesus? And I love that Maurice brought up that song because I wanted to post that. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. It's the only thing that there's just too little of. And if you really want to equate that to the umpteenth degree and speak about the wisdom from above, if God wanted to sing that song and what that looked like, this is how God would sing it. What the world needs now is Christ, sweet Christ. It's the only thing that people know too little of. What the world needs now is Christ, sweet Christ. You see? But everybody, man, that spoke, everything you guys said, just know it was by inspiration of the Holy Spirit. And it needed to be said, and it needed to be brought out. And it's a perfect example. Everything everybody said were perfect things that needed to come to the table and that we need to consider.
My heart feels for someone that I know is going to speak something and that it won't be heard. You know, and that's what I was going to ask you about. You know, like, I mean, I can see the pouting prophets. I can. I can see them, and my heart hurts for them, and I'm like, I don't want to pick you up. You know? I mean, because I feel that. I feel that fear of being, I know what I have to speak, and it won't be heard, or I'll be pushed out for it. I mean, I feel that. It comes on me, and then the only thing I'm left with is, you know, I'll lay myself down on this, you know. But while you were talking, and I was still trying to figure out, there has to be more than I just lay myself down on this. And then it was like, well, watch Greg. and while you were talking, I saw that yeah, you were laying yourself down, but at the same time, I saw an excitement well up in you that I knew that's God's life. You know, it's like you can be rejected and outcast for speaking truth, and then yet the truth just dwells in you so much that you can't stay down.
Yeah.
You know, it's like he's going to keep pulling you up, and then you get to keep speaking what you know is truth.
You'll even rejoice in that feeling of weakness. Listen, I mean, I probably wouldn't use the same words, but yeah, but the pouting prophet, you know how you help the pouting prophet, or the prophet that feels pressed in on, that feels discouraged? You know how you help the pouting prophet? You come and remind him he was crucified with Christ. Because if he's a prophet, he knows exactly what that means. And he knows by viewing that, he will be set free from everything that's bringing his soul pain. You see, and I actually find myself now, it doesn't feel nice to my flesh. Don't misunderstand me. My flesh feels uncomfortable when I feel pressed in on. But I almost find my heart rejoicing even when my flesh feels uncomfortable, because I know that this is an opportunity to fellowship with the truth of what it means that I was crucified with Christ. And that's going to circumcise my heart even more from the life that's in the world. And even should I speak forth a good word, and a word that's the truth, and a word that's full of power, it's still looking for life in the world if I'm looking around to see whether or not it's received for my joy. You see? Even I could say a good thing. I could say a powerful thing. I could say the thing everybody needs to hear. But even should I look for peace by whether or not it's received and whether or not people say amen, that would still be the life that's in the world. I mean, what did Jesus say? Unless you eat my words, they are spirit and they are life. I mean, you can't understand it with the carnal mind, but what I'm saying will bring forth life. And you try to define it with the carnal mind, you won't understand anything I said. Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part in my life. Everybody left. What did Jesus say? Will you leave now too? See, the prince of this world had nothing in Jesus. The reason he had nothing in Jesus is because Jesus didn't look on the life he could have from the world and define his life by that. He didn't look at whether he could have justice or injustice in the world. He didn't look at whether people would agree with him or not agree with him. He didn't look at whether people would hear what he said or not hear what he said and define his life by that. And so the prince of this world had nothing in him. He couldn't come and say, look at the great injustice you've experienced, and compel him to try to justify himself. He couldn't say, look, are you really the Son of God? They all left, man. Are you really the prophet Moses talked about? Where's your people? See, he had nothing in him because Jesus didn't define himself or his life by any of those things. So every time you point to one of those things, Jesus is like, man, I've considered myself dead to the world and the life that's in the world many moons ago. Many moons ago. I grew up Jewish. I was a Jew according to the flesh. Do you know what we did? We celebrated the Passover every year. Do you know what the blood that was sprinkled on the lintels and the doorposts declared? The blood declares that you consider yourself dead to the life that's in the world and you consider yourself alive to God and His life. The blood that was sprinkled on the doorpost and the lintel, it was in the shape of a cross. And when Jesus was a young boy and he was celebrating the Passover, he wasn't busy thinking all the things everybody else around him was thinking. Do you know what he was thinking? Man, that blood declares a word that I'm dead to the life I can have from the world and the life I can bring about through my own ability, and I'm alive to the life of God. Man, that's what the blood declares. See, Jesus had that in his heart. And so the prince of this world, had nothing in him because he considered himself dead to the life he could get from the world. He considered himself dead to the life he could get from the flesh. And he considered himself alive to God and God's life. You know, in Leviticus it goes on and on about how when you kill an animal and eat an animal, that you can't drink its blood. That you can't eat flesh with blood in it. And then it goes on to say, because the life of the flesh, or the power of the flesh, is found in the blood. So the blood, Christianity misses this a lot because we don't study Jewish background. But in the Jewish mind, sacrifice did not only pertain to substitution. Atonement did not only pertain to substitution. They looked at it as many different things. And so when the Jewish people celebrated the Passover, the Hebrews were enslaved. They didn't look at that as a sacrifice for their transgressions. That's not how they saw it. That's not how they saw the blood of the Passover. They saw the blood of the Passover as being something that could cause them to come closer to God. And come closer to God in the sense of they could ascend above a natural corruptible state and ascend to the state of God. Well, what's the state of God? Immortality. His life is incorruptible. And so they viewed a part of the sacrifice as a coming closer to the God in the sense of man has a perishable body and God's life is imperishable. And so the blood spoke something that could cause them to ascend above a perishable state into an imperishable state and thus come closer to God.
The blood there on the lintel saved them from death.
Right.
Simple as that. That's all they saw was, we put this blood up here, we ain't going to die.
Right. And death is a perishable state, isn't it? And so they ascended above a perishable state. Perishing and death passed over them. And if you want to say it the right kind of way, and I'm going to get into it hardcore today, they overcame death in a corruptible state by the blood. Right? So the power of the flesh is in the blood. And so when you believe on, Revelation says, and you overcome the serpent and the serpent's system of sin and death by the blood of the Lamb. Wasn't it a lamb they killed at the Passover? And the word of your testimony. Well, the blood declares a word. The Bible talks about Abel's blood declaring a word and Jesus' blood declaring a word. Do you know what the blood declares? The blood declares, not by my strength, O God, not by the strength of the flesh will I be exalted and have life, but by your strength and your grace, O God. Why? Because the life of the flesh is in the blood. And so when the blood runs out of the flesh, it declares the death of the flesh. And so when you come with the blood or declare your belief in the blood, you're declaring that you consider your life to be dead to the life you can have from the flesh and alive to the life you can have from God. Now you ain't going to hear that in Christianity because they don't understand that. Why did Jesus appear in the heavenlies with his blood? What did it mean? Do you know what he was declaring to God? Not by strength of my hand, O God, will I be exalted and have life, but by you and your grace. Do you know what his blood declared? I rested in you and your grace, God, and I didn't trust in my own strength. The blood ran out of his flesh, didn't it? Why did the blood run out of his flesh? Because he didn't place his trust in his flesh. He let his flesh die. That was Jesus in his heart, first considering himself dead to the life he could have from the flesh. And because his heart considered himself dead to the life he could have from the flesh, he rested. His flesh rested on the cross. Then his blood could run out of that flesh, declaring his death to the life he could have from the world and the life he could have through the strength of man, the arm of man. And it declared him that he considered himself alive to God and that he rested in God and God's grace. That's why Abel brought blood. Right. When he brought blood to God. Right. Not by my strength, O God, will I be exalted. Right. The blood declares that you consider yourself dead to the flesh. Why? Because the life or the power of the flesh is in the blood. See, that's an aspect of it. Now listen, that's not to say that an aspect of the sacrifice isn't substitution. We were all dying. Death was reigning over us, and we needed someone to die away our death. So as far as substitution, it wasn't penal in the sense that God's the one who killed us and Jesus took our place in the sense that God killed him instead of killing us. But we were all dying. God wasn't the author of the death we were dying, but we were dying. And so Jesus came and died our death. He came as us and for us to take our death upon himself so that it could be moved out of the way. The blood, it's the manifold wisdom of God. There's so much wisdom contained in what happened with the blood. So you know what we would say? We think that the blood on the doorpost caused the children of Israel, or the Hebrews, to overcome God on the night of the Passover. But you know what Revelation says? They overcame God And God's angel by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony? Is that what Revelation 12:11 says? No. It says they overcame the serpent and the serpent's sin and death by the blood of the Lamb and the word that blood on their doorposts declared. Now, how did they overcome the serpent and the serpent system of sin and death? By the blood on the doorpost. The blood on the doorpost declared to God that they considered themselves dead to the life they could have through their own works. And they considered themselves alive to the life they could have from God. That blood declared that to God. And then God, what He did was, He didn't suffer the destroyer to serve them with His death. And I'm going to get into that today, but, we think the destroyer is God. We define the angel of death as something that is in heaven. Jesus said the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy.
Right.
Who comes to steal, kill, and destroy? The thief. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 9 and 10. Paul says that they were destroyed of the serpents and they were destroyed of the destroyer. He doesn't say they were destroyed by God. And so we're going to look at these verses and we're going to do just like a good old-fashioned Bible study and look at these verses and look at these words and just let the Spirit of God talk to us and bring all of the Bible together. But Revelation 12 and 11 gives shape to the Passover. The reason why, it talks about the blood and it talks about the Lamb. The blood and the Lamb were both present at the Passover, aren't they? The Bible doesn't contradict itself. The Bible all the way through from beginning to end is speaking of the same things. So whatever we think about the blood of the Lamb in Revelation is the same thing we got to think about the blood of the Lamb at the Passover. And if they don't fit, then that's our indication that there's some part of how we're seeing it that doesn't line up. We don't have to feel sad or upset. We can just say, Lord, bring clarity. Right? And even after what I say today, I'm sure there's going to be a lot more clarity that can come to how I'll explain it. But it'll be what it will be. And so listen,